Good morning, and welcome to our Recession Scenario Planning Webcast, hosted by CEO Coaching International. My name is Don Schiavone, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Managing Director of CEO Coaching International. The interest from our webcast last week on preparing for the recession was extraordinary. If you haven't watched the webcast last week, the link is in the chat box. In that webinar, we stressed the need to create scenarios over forecasts and playbooks over plans. The number one request we heard from the webinar was, how do I actually shift from forecasting to scenario planning? That's a great question, and it's one we will answer in depth during today's webcast. So for context, the leading indicators that a recession is coming are all around us. As you may have heard, US inflation is at a 40-year high. Companies, including Coinbase, Peloton, Carvana, Redfin, Tesla, Netflix, PayPal, and many more have all made or are planning to make major layoffs. Additionally, Meritage home showings are down 35% from 2 months ago. Amazon is selling over 30% of the new warehouse and distribution space they have under construction. Retail stocks, a barometer for the wider economy, have lost a third of their value since their recent peaks. Despite these dire leading indicators, we are hearing from many CEOs saying, hey, my business is doing well. While some businesses may be hurt in the recession, I'm not convinced this is going to hurt me. We have finally recovered from the pandemic, and our business is better than it's ever been. Why all this talk of doom and gloom? Maybe your business will be fine, but recognize that your suppliers and your customers may not be in as strong a position as you are. Furthermore, your job as CEO is to anticipate potential problems. Don't wait until you wake up and find your number one customer filed Chapter 11, and now all of a sudden your business is in peril. A key supplier or a key customer could wake up on the other side of this recession or in the midst of this recession and not be as strong as expected. That is why we conduct scenario planning. We see all too often how leaders rationalize problems and live in denial. But at some point, the data clearly points to a trend. So when are you going to do something about it? This is not about being paranoid. It's about being opportunistic. How do we leverage the opportunities that may come about while minimizing the risks? What if, through this recession, we can force some competitors out of the system? What if we can make the future of our business better by avoiding the avoidable traps? Too many people overestimate how temporary the problem will be. With hindsight, people always say, I wish I started taking action earlier. This affects everyone because even if you don't think it's going to impact your business negatively, there's a lot of offensive things you can do, and there's a lot of ways you can be opportunistic in this kind of economy. Those leaders that say, it doesn't affect me, are myopic in their thinking. So what's the worst that can happen here? We stress test the business a little bit and prepare for some scenarios that never actually happen? You know what? So what if we did a little extra planning? Okay, it's not such a big investment, and possibly the creativity that we tapped in the process could lead to new ideas. So how do I actually do scenario planning? Although it may sound obvious, we are often asked, what do I actually have to do and what data do I need? How do I get all that data put together, and how do I determine these indicators that are going to affect me? An economist can tell you why a recession is happening, but they can't tell you what you should do to overcome and conquer it. Our panel of experts are here to share their battle-tested wisdom. Now, let's introduce our panelists. First, Jaime Schultz.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jaime, and I've been in the consumer goods manufacturing companies such as Procter & Gamble, Wesley Johnson, Kodak, and Goodyear. Also in restaurants through a private equity company, fashion with Levi's, and equipment and service with Kodak. And a lot of crises and recessions there, like, for example, category crisis with Kodak losing 2/3 of its category in 4 years, a category we invented and became a $200 million category, just to see 90% of the category disappear in 3 years, 80% inflation a month, 50% devaluations, GDP growing down double digits in Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. So a lot of learnings to share with you guys, and I'm looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jaime. Kevin Adams.
Thanks, Don. It's a pleasure to be on the panel. Again, my name is Kevin, and I'm an executive from the food and dietary supplement industry. A lot of my success came at Isagenix, where we grew our business from 300 million to over 925 million organically. But before all that success, we actually weathered through the recession of 2008 and 2009. And we really learned how to manage our business, and we actually strengthened our business through that process. So what Don said about exercising creativity and looking at business in new ways, that's what set us up for success. So happy to talk through all of these different scenarios today.
Thank you, Kevin. Ramona Capello.
Good morning. I'm Ramona Capello. I've spent over 30 years as a turnaround artist, particularly from recessions or frankly blind spots in bad management, and as an entrepreneur, including companies like Celestial Seasonings, Kendall Jackson Family Wineries, Mauna Loa Nut Company, and Nestle, where I actually created Coffee Mate Liquid, as well as I've started several other companies, including one I founded successfully, raising growth capital in 2008 during the last Great Recession. Lots to talk about this morning.
Thank you, Ramona. And last but certainly not least, Shep Moyle.
Good morning. My name is Shep Moyle, and I've spent the last 30 years working to transform our family business in the consumer e-commerce space to become recession resilient and in becoming an expert in managing bank relationships when in crisis.
Awesome. And actually, we have one more panelist joining, Randy Dewey.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, Toronto-based, been a 30-year C-suite veteran. Experiences in telecommunications, automotive, and printing would be the three main sectors over the last 30 years. Weathered 4 recessions, 2 hostile takeovers, led 10 companies through tumult and grew them all. Battle hardened and ready for recession 5 and how to plan scenarios. So thanks very much for having me on the panel today, Don.
Awesome. Thank you, panelists. And before we begin, I'd like to take a quick poll. All of you attending live, please answer this question. Is your company prepared if a recession hits? Please respond now. All right, thank you. And the results are, we have, wow, 67% say yes, they are prepared if a recession hits, and 33% say no. All right, well, let's jump right into it. Panelists, so welcome to the discussion. I'd like to tackle this discussion using our 4-step scenario planning framework, one step at a time. As a reminder, the 4 steps are, number 1, take inventory of your risks. Step 2, identify leading indicators of the risks. Step 3, forecast the various scenarios. And step 4, develop risk mitigation strategies for the top risks. So let's start with step 1, take an inventory of risks. Panelists, let's talk about the biggest risks to the businesses you've run and coached and give us a sense of the potential impacts of these risks. Let's start with you, Jaime.
Thanks, Don. We'll talk about a lot of risks that are obvious that everybody looks at, but my biggest learning is that the companies and we suffer the most not overlooking risks that are not obvious or they are not on the surface. For example, contracts that we have, they're on a desk somewhere, either a supplier contract or a union contract, or for example, airport contracts we had in our restaurant business. Nobody remembers that, but there are clauses there that with the recession, with the volume going down and the operational leverage of the business being so high, we would break those contracts. The banks, some of the covenants. So it's going to be very easy for us to look at risks such as category, market share, pricing, so on and so forth, and miss those risks that are not on the surface. And second is what is the potential unintended consequences of actions we're going to take with a crisis, especially on people and key stakeholders. And an interesting example I have is when I was with Kodak, one of the things we did with the recession, obviously, we cut our workforce, but we failed to understand, because we wanted to protect the top 20%, we failed to understand there's a lot of people who belong to the same families. So sometimes we're going to shut down a plant and we would basically let go 3 people of the same family. And then we would have some people in the family who are still in the company we want to keep. And the unintended consequences were huge. So number one, identify the risks that are not obvious. And number two, what are the unintended consequences when we start tackling those risks?
Yeah, thank you, Jaime. You know, and having your experience to live through this is instrumental. Thank you. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of people work at looking at their customer and trying to understand their customer. And a lot of people look backward and look what's been happening with our customer. A lot of people don't get ahead of that and anticipate what's going to happen. And that's a big risk in a changing environment, right? It's a rapidly changing environment. So you have to anticipate, look ahead, get in front of the customer. The second thing that I think is really key is look at where you're sole sourced or where you're reliant on a single person or a single company. So, those are points of vulnerability, and those can change very quickly. If you have a key supplier, a key manufacturer, key customer, whatever it is, key employee, those things can change very quickly and leave you out. And then the last is be prepared to strike. Be prepared to, if opportunities come, are you ready to take on those challenges? So that's the other, I call it a risk of missing out, right? So if you're not ready to strike, you may lose out.
Yeah, I like that, Kevin. It's the risk of inaction, right? As Jim Collins says, what's your return on luck? Love it. Yeah. Ramona.
Yeah, Don, in addition to the comments that my associates have made, which was super great, I think one of the things that people don't do today especially is look at data trending. So we look often, we will pull up the reports on our database system and we'll see where we are today. I went through this with a client yesterday. I said, how are your receivables trending? How is your volume with your top customers trending? And they kept pulling up month by month. And I said, we have to look at it trended because you will start to see arcs. I even like to look at data in 3-month rolling trends to start to see when things start to shift. So you don't just look at the erratic nature of some of the dynamics that are going on today. The other thing is pull your team together, because the CEO's job is not to have the best ideas, but to be able to get the best ideas. And whether that's talking to your leadership team, your customers, your suppliers, their customers or suppliers, you will gain all kinds of insights as to what's going on. Don't be afraid to have the conversation. Ask them how they're preparing for risks that are coming, if they're preparing, because that's an early indicator as to whether you may have a domino effect with your business. So those are a couple of ideas.
Thanks, Ramona. And interesting insight. Don't confuse seasonality for what might be an early indicator of a recession trend, and then inspirational leadership, right? You don't have to have all the answers, but inspire our teams to get them. Thank you. Shep.
Don, 2 key lessons. 1, never run out of cash. This is a key risk for all of us with our banks and financing partners. If you don't think they will reduce your covenants, if you don't think they will reduce your credit line, and if you don't think they might pull your credit line completely, you are misguided. It may be that your industry just falls out of favor. You may be doing well, but the banks will become afraid and they will lead with fear. So look at those scenarios, be prepared. Things that you can do with your bank: communicate, give them your scenarios, understand the risks and the likelihoods. Look at all of the available options. Pull on your credit line now and put that money in another account and have that available for you do weekly cash management piece. So understand that maintaining your cash position is number one. Number two is understand your personal risk, that if things don't go as you anticipate, what is your risk in your salary, your income, what you get out of the business in expenses and from your buildings. Understand what your risk is personally in addition to the business risk.
Yeah, thank you, Shep. Cash is king. Can't emphasize that enough. And we'll continue to talk about that. You know, I like your advice as well, as if you have a line of credit and later you'll see our Sense liquidity test tool. If there's any risk of liquidity, get your hands on that cash now before covenants are tripped or before liquidity, your cash markets dry up. So great advice. Thank you, Shep. Randy.
Yeah, thanks. You know, what the advice given already is really bang on. You know, keep your head up, make sure you're out there, because a lot of the information, you know, that is going to be transpiring is oftentimes going to hit your customers before it hits you, may hit your suppliers before it hits you. But if you're not out there and we're too inward focused, then we'll sometimes miss the warning signs that are coming at us. And those warning signs come through our industry as well as some of our big customers and big suppliers. So keeping your head up and getting out there and communicating with your customers and key suppliers is absolutely essential. And to Shep's point, financial crisis is only 2 steps away. Plan. If you over plan, you never get criticized for that. But if you under planned, you're certainly up for that. But so you want to make sure you put your big leading indicators in place and make sure you've got your head up and the financial house is really in order, or at least you can anticipate it. So you need to have that plan solid and ready to go.
Awesome. Jaime?
I just want to build on what Shep said. You know, cash is also working capital. Inventory is cash. Accounts receivable is cash. Accounts payable is cash. So what's within our inventory that is not moving and we have to sell really fast? What's the replacement cost versus the acquisition cost? How do we do that with the controllers? Do we understand that? And if the replacement cost is much higher than the acquisition cost, what we're doing on pricing to deal with that? So working capital management is something that is largely overlooked in most of the companies I work with. And I deal now because people think, you know, rightfully so, Shep, on the covenants, on the cash, but working capital is cash.
Yep. Hey, so Jaime, some of this, and 1 second, Ramona, some of the things you said leads us right into step 2, because we talked about taking inventory of your risks. That's the inward looking. Let's look at our own risks from our business and certainly our suppliers and our customers, those risks. What are the leading indicators of the risks? What's the canary in the coal mine, the early warning signals that might say, you know what, our business is going to be impacted or may be impacted, and what should we be looking for? Ramona, you want to kick us off there?
Sure. I do just want to add one more comment,
Sure.
Which is understanding your competitors' strengths and weaknesses, because they may be able to move faster than we can, or we can move faster than they can, but trying to anticipate what a competitor will do may give us all kinds of insights as to what our risks are and frankly, what our opportunities are. But to talk about the leading indicators, there are so many leading indicators. You might start to get that, you know, feeling on the back of your neck when you're talking to customers who are asking questions about orders they've placed, right? They may not actually change behavior yet, but they start to ask questions. Are you offering terms? Can I push this out? Can I change the volume? Can I change the discount levels? Those are all indications they're thinking or planning for changes with their business.
And clearly those changes will lead to impact in yours, right? Especially if they start to delay orders, pull orders, your backlog starts to grow. Absolutely.
Absolutely. You might start to see people shifting what they're buying. So they may have been buying more of your luxury goods or your higher end goods. Now they're buying the more affordable goods, which may have an impact on margin for you. Or they may be shifting to alternative products you don't offer. So you have to start looking at these, and that's why I think trends are important. You can't just look at 1 month at a time. You have to start seeing these because the indications are all there. Sales channels close or open. People start shopping in different ways to save money or to minimize orders. I mean, you have to really start looking at what you're hearing, what you're seeing, and
Sure.
consider your strategic partners who you might be able, who you depend on for business or opportunities. Talk to them about what they're seeing.
Right, and looking, and we, as you know, Jaime was also saying too, this is where identifying those leading indicators is looking outward, looking at the macroeconomic trends. What is the impact of something of historic prices in gas and fuel, right? What's that do to your industry? How might that play a role? Shep.
Well, what I've seen in my experience in the consumer space, building upon what Ramona said, is one, we're going to start to see increasing discounting across the board. So watching competitors and seeing how your customers are responding to promotions, and then that gross margin impact. Second, you'll start to see your cost of consumer acquisition go up. So the cost of getting that new customer is going to increase. Third, you're going to see channel movement. So they will be moving from you to providers like an Amazon and like a Walmart, where you don't own that customer. And those are key indicators as well. And you will see your average order size decrease. So think of those things that you can do to provide value and bundle to maintain your average order as you look at these leading indicators.
Excellent. Thank you. Kevin.
Yeah, so Don, one of the things that we looked at was, the overall order value from the consumer. And so everyone thinks people move to value means they look for less cost per serving, et cetera, but that's not necessarily the case. So instead of buying a 30-day supply, they might want to buy a 1-week supply or a 2-week supply. So thinking about how we can, look at consumer behavior to know if it's moving toward shorter quantities, I think that's one of the indicators. The second one, I think, which is really important is, listen to the signs that your suppliers and customers are giving. If suppliers are pushing things back because they say, well, I've got a labor shortage, I've got other issues, that's a real sign that that company's probably struggling. And so don't just say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we can move our order to next week. Start to think what's behind that, what's really going on at that company, because those are really like non-financial leading indicators that really can tell you a lot.
Yeah, what I like about what you're saying, Kevin, is also look at what could be considered as potential market weaknesses and how do you turn them into strengths. Reminds me of a story of a trucking company client we have that was concerned about having to lay off their staff and worry about their orders because they were concerned that the trucking shipping would dry up because of their customers running out of business. They approached it differently, and they approached key customers and said, we can change our SLAs to guarantee space for you. And working with their customers were panicking that this very impact might happen. So they turned that around and said, let's actually get guarantees and help our clients who would really be worried about this systemic economic factor, and turn that into a huge win for them. Jaime.
You guys are awesome talking about the content, which leading indicators are important. And you're also talking about outside in, right? Looking at your stakeholders, which I just want to offer a slightly different perspective, which I live, which is sometimes when you identify those leading indicators, identify those risks, they become too unpredictable. Some of the things, where's the bottom? How much, the market is going to go down? And one of the things I learned, when you wanted to increase predictability, the more predictable you are, the more predictable we can understand which actions to take. No? And one thing Ramona said, which I love, which is the sensors in the marketplace. So I learned one of the things we have to do is to increase the frequency and reduce the complexity of acquiring those signals from the stakeholders. And let me give you a couple very specific examples, right? So for example, on people, for a couple of companies like P&G and Goodyear, we used to do biannual employee satisfaction. And they were like 10 pages and everything. And we changed that to an employee net promoter score. It's just 2 questions. And we started doing this every month. So a huge change, and it allowed us to understand and get data fast. The same thing happened at Kodak with the category going down big time. Instead of looking at Nielsen and syndicated data, we just took film and digital camera sales ratio during the top 6 buying occasions in the top 20 retailers. So we were very specific, and instead of waiting 2 months, 3 months for the results, we started measuring that on a weekly basis. That allowed us to get ahead of the curve and cover a $300 million gap in profitability by getting ahead of the curve 4 months before any of our competitors.
I love what I'm hearing is, number one, how do we accelerate the use of data and to make decisions, the speed of decision making, and not waiting the normal path, so to being creative. Secondly, what are our actual employees telling us about this, right? Ramona, you're shaking your head. Maybe you could talk about, like, they're hearing the same messages. Their mortgage rates are going up. Their ability to get to the office at the same cost with the gas prices are changing. How are they potentially a leading indicator of what we should be doing? How should we be managing that?
Yeah, you just think about, you're magnifying the number of inputs you're able to get by talking to your own employees, because they have spouses, they have children, they have friends and family. They're having these conversations around the dinner table or at the coffee shop, right? So many more data points that are literally inexpensive to tap into. I also want to change the lens just a little bit. While we're observing these facts and this data, changing the lens to what can we do about them to our advantage, right? Because in every problem is an opportunity, and we'll either take advantage of the opportunity or somebody else will. But not just, hey, what are you seeing? What are the problems that we're having? What can we do about it? What would make our customers happy? What would make our suppliers happy? And it may be simple little things that are of deep value to them and no cost to us. So we always have to constantly think about this. I had a conversation with a client yesterday on this topic. He needs to show for his bankers improved margins. So I said, how about how you're going to market? Change the pricing dynamics to value added later. They affect your margins, and they don't affect, and they may actually improve the impact in the marketplace, but they don't impact what the retailer is getting from you. It's just what bucket they go in can have a dramatic impact on whether you get financing or not. So there's all kinds of ways of breaking down the challenges into data points where you can give and take with your customers, with your vendors, and look for the opportunities that are cheap to you and of high value to them.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to shift gears here now. So we talked about step one, taking inventory of your risks. Step two, identifying the leading indicators that those risks may actually be coming to fruition. Let's look at step three, forecasting different scenarios. This is the meat of what we're trying to help you with here. In our last webcast, we introduced the liquidity test tool. I like to revisit this tool now, but with the addition of a sensitivity analysis that can drive important scenario modeling. Randy, please take it away.
Thank you, Don. So as we outlined last week in the webcast, this quick liquidity test is a really simple yet really powerful view to your financial foundation. It's not in any sense like a deep dive, but it's enough directionally to give you a sense of where you need to be focused on and some of the questions, core questions that you need to be asking yourself. So we want to be able to make sure that we position ourselves and look at it from all of the different angles. And Shep, I think, said last week, never waste a good crisis. And that is absolutely true. We're in a situation here where we've got an impending recession. It's really upon us. But how do we do that? How do we actually thrive through that? Well, in order to thrive, we need to have our financial house in order and know exactly where our most vulnerable points are. So as you see from this, from the model, we have a company about $4.5 million in sales, 35% gross margins, decent situation, plugged in the hit of 25% revenue. Things look okay. They've got, things are stable in a sense and are burning cash and everything looks okay. If I just slide to the right of the model, you'll see on the sensitivity analysis a couple of key questions that you need to be challenging yourself. What if this isn't an 18-month recession? Most recessions are on average 15 to 18 months, but what happens if it goes longer? You can see down at the bottom of this chart at the 24 mark, everything's okay at 24 months if it went that long, assuming we stick at 35% gross margin. But if we start to see even a 5% margin erosion, we quickly fall offside. Take that one parameter and also then consider it at the top. What happens if revenue is hit a little bit harder? What happens if my revenue is greater than 25%, maybe 30%. Well, all of a sudden it doesn't take but a couple points of margin and I'm now offside. So two factors create a very different scenario. And if I just slide that back over to the model and just quickly plug in, 29% and say it went for 24 months long, well, quickly, I'm now offside. I've got now 5.7 months of cash, and I'm quickly in a situation where I've got to respond. So what's important about this is that, if you go back to the premise, if margin was softer, meaning if my customers were pushing back on it, competitors came in with heavier prices, or there was cost pushes from my suppliers, I'm quickly in a position where if I lose a bit of margin and all of a sudden this goes a little longer, my scenario is now different. So now out of this, I'm going to take, some very close looks at, my finance groups. How do we make sure that we can get $1 million if we need to? How do I get my OPEX down? You can see from the bottom here, the 61,000. How do I get 61,000 out of my 775 of non-people cost OPEX? And then how do I then take my sales team and say, hey, look, we cannot afford to have volume hits or margin hits. So what's the plan to make sure that we sustain those? Now I've got 3 projects now in the event of a situation. I now can get ahead of it, 3 reasonable projects to help make sure my business is robust and working through this recession, and not just working, but actually thriving, and then being able to liberate that capital to actually use it to pivot the business into some even more exciting territory. So anyways, I think that's probably good to cover that in quick terms, Don, but this model can be used to really help push us even out of our comfort zone to look at the company in a way that is a bit objective, but also leads us to some good conclusions.
No, thank you, Randy. And what I love about this is, first, you have to start with a simple model of your business. Don't overanalyze. Don't try and boil the ocean. So we have a simple model of our business. Second, we use sensitivity analysis to vary a couple of the key drivers and to determine at what point do those drivers get us into trouble. That sensitivity analysis then drives the scenarios to pursue. Look at best case, worst case scenarios of when things start to pivot with that driver. And then, as Randy said, identify potential playbooks for those scenarios that might cause problems. Thank you. Thank you, Randy. And rest of our team, thoughts, or what else could we add to this scenario planning discussion? Ramona.
Boy, Don, there's so much that we can do. Particularly if you're looking at the supply side. We all know during COVID how deeply affected many of the supply channels were. So just a couple of thoughts on that category alone. How about no more single source suppliers for any ingredients, let alone just our key ingredients, right? The other thought is, if you're having trouble getting ingredients, I have a client who couldn't get salt to run their food operation. Couldn't get it in, couldn't run the product without salt. Went to a neighboring manufacturer in the geographic area, said, do you have any salt I can buy? They've now turned that into co-buying. So neither one of them is putting out as much cash to get a full truckload. They're sharing the truckload. So it reduces their costs, and now they're helping supply each other on other ingredients. So thinking out of the box about where to get your supply, who might have inventory. The flip of that is, what if there's customers you have wanted to get in business with and they've never let you in because they've had long-standing contracts with a major other supplier? How about you get a piece of that business now when they don't want to have a single source supplier? Again, these create opportunities to think differently about how we control our costs and create opportunities.
Awesome, thank you. Kevin, then Jaime.
Yeah, I love the sensitivity analysis, and I agree you have to keep it kind of high level and simple, but you could do that by segment of business as well. If you've got 3 major channels, break it down by channel, because it's easier then to look at what the high and low case may be. Look at, different scenarios for products, maybe product groupings, but I think you could cascade this down until you really get to where you say, okay, this is actionable information. So awesome tool. I think everybody will benefit from it.
Thank you. Jaime. Jaime, you're mute.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things I always do is the power of our people, right? So I ask everybody, I love the concept of bookends, which is what's the worst and what's the best that can happen. And take each one of my leaders and say, create a menu of options. So from the stuff and take into account the probability. So which decisions, and Ramon, I love what you're saying too, which decisions can we make on sourcing? And then take the person in logistics and warehousing and take the person in marketing. Which decisions can you make that will have an immediate impact in the bottom line? Then which are the projects that are proven correct? So if I launch a line extension, it's a core competence we have. So we will, have some efforts, but we're going to get something in return. Which are the projects that are more difficult, and which are the things that will protect our reputation, and create a non-emotional list of the possibilities. So instead of discussing with the team what's right to do, what's not right to do, because you lose a lot of time when there's a recession. People start fighting for what's right, what's wrong. No, we shouldn't, cut 30% of the workforce. We should cut 15%. And by the way, we should wait 3 months. No. Let's put the options in a piece of paper unemotionally. And then each department puts that. And then I agglutinate all this in stuff that were decisions, black and white, straight to the bottom line. Pricing, absolutely straight to the bottom line. Cost, straight absolute to the bottom line. Projects that are simple, straight absolute to the bottom line. There's a say in P&G that say, how do you turn administrative work into accomplishment? Which means we're going to be very purposeful and intentional when we create those lists in a way that it creates the insights for whatever result of the sensitivity analysis. We have the menu of options, and then we can get everybody and say, okay, what makes most sense within the decisions, within the projects, and the things we're going to try harder.
Well, fantastic. And that takes us to step 4, because the final step is develop the risk mitigation strategies for the top risks. And to do that, I'd like to introduce another tool, our risk inventory exercise, that will help you identify your top risks. Randy?
Thank you, Don. So risk, obviously, in any business at any point in time is something that we always face. But in the face of a recession and a lot of variables, the potential that things could go sideways quickly is always there, no matter what. And it's important, and it's incumbent upon management, really, for us to sit back and do an objective evaluation. And sometimes that's hard because we're sometimes in the thick of it, and we only see sometimes the information that's around us. But often we have to stand back and really consider. So what we've built here is a really good risk assessment tool. It forces you to look at things from what is the potential consequences if all things considered that happened? What would that mean to me in the business? And then, well, what's the likelihood of that happening from 1 to 10? Is it not likely? Is that pretty remote? Or no, there's actually a potential that could happen. We put together 15 very core questions that need to be considered. And this is really a group exercise. It's really something where you sit back and you really think about it, get some input and assess these things, and not just one opinion, but many opinions can be very helpful in this situation and certainly in a guided moment. So when you sit there and consider it, there's 5 key areas that we really need to consider. What are the macro and economic issues and some of those market drivers, and how does that impact me? We got 3 questions here that really sort of drive down and to consider what the impact could be in that category. Second is the strategy and the tactical. What assumptions did we make in our strategy that now have changed or potentially could even be vastly different, in 6 and 12 months from now. And then as well, the financial foundation, which we talked a little bit about the liquidity test. How are we with our banks? How close are we or not so close? How much of our availability is there? What happens if things start to erode? Where do we find sources of capital if we need it? And then the next section is operational and supply chain. We've seen boats locked up on the Pacific Ocean for 2 years now, and there's been lockdowns, supply chain issues. How that, if those got worse, what could that mean, and how could operational impacts actually affect us even greater? And then lastly, and most importantly, is your talent. We're your people. We've all had issues with getting hires done and as well key positions, but we've got vulnerabilities with talent and people. And then going through and making that really objective assessment then populates the second tab of the tool. It kind of pops into there exactly what is it that I should be thinking about. In this case, and you would see people and talent and financial. It is enough of a risk here that's worthy of us sitting back and planning. So, in the spirit of making sure that we're focused, this is a great tool to help us really focus on the 1 or 2 key areas that really need to be planned out and thought through. The questions help you lead to some of the areas of weakness. From there, then we want to build a more extensive plan to help make sure that we are prepared for that and that we're there. This helps us get rid of the surprise factor. If we sit back and think about these things and recognize the potentials and then prepare ourselves in the organization, then we have that playbook ready to go, then when that eventuality either happens or doesn't happen, we're ready. We're ready either way. And management can't be faulted if they're sitting there in a position of readiness and having thought things through. You're going to respond quicker, your people are going to have a lot more confidence, and you're going to be able to get on the other side of that far quicker.
Thank you, Randy. And one of the things we strive for with our clients is to use recession planning sessions to get in front of this. And tools like this are a great way to use your management team and have each of them independently fill out the risk assessment on the first tab. And then you can certainly use averages, but I like to force healthy debate whenever I see very divergent thinking and answering the question. So someone answers a 1, someone answers a 10. They're seeing the world very differently, and that's where the gold is in uncovering what's happening and what's causing people to think so differently, because a lot of times there's opportunity as well as risk. Awesome. Shep.
Don, I think these are fantastic tools, and they're wonderful tripwires for all of those listening to us today to understand what are my risks and what could happen to my business. I found there are 3 key things that have to happen next after we determine that we are at risk, and in some cases, we probably will be at some level. One is to engage broadly. So be transparent with your organization. Crowdsource ideas. Crowdsource the risks that your entire company uses. We did this in all of our weekly stand-ups, and what it does is it demystifies the concerns and the worries about a recession. So the more transparent that we are and the more we engage broadly, the more your team will come up with ideas that you probably haven't thought of. Secondly, measure specifically. So particularly around cash, start measuring your cash forecasting accuracy. In my business, I found when we started doing this, our forecasting accuracy on cash was nowhere near what it could be and nowhere near the other metrics we used in our business, like gross margin. And then third is customer insight. Do the simple things of asking your customer directly, how can we help? What are you worried about and how can we help you? Do those 3 things, and then you take these tools down to the next level.
I love that, Shep, and I'd add one more. Work with your suppliers as well, right? Work back the chain as well. How can you help them, and how can you make it a win-win? Awesome. Anyone else? Jaime, and then Kevin.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Shep, one of the other things, this is great when we involve everybody and crowdsource the ideas, but creativity thrives in constraint. The more we're able to, define the key problems we're trying to solve and understand where they are, the bigger the chance of success. And an example is we operate as human beings. We have our paradigms, and we live based on our paradigms. When we expand that idea of what's addressable and not addressable, we get great ideas. And I love giving specific examples. Like I was we had a business in Venezuela. The country was shutting down, invading the factories, impeding us from taking money out. And we basically crowdsource and say, these are the 2 problems we have. We don't want our factory to be invaded, and we want to be able to operate. And through a process like this, we're able to come up with an idea, and we took over the whole bus tire system in Venezuela. Because we did that, the government couldn't enter our factory because we're producing. We would stop the country if they did that. And the second thing we did, we started building a school in a community. So when people started trying to invade the factory, all the community was there to protect us. And I have example after example that the best ideas came from throughout the organization by us framing the problem really specifically so that people come into play. And in P&G, when we had a recession, because people stopped buying Pampers, you know what we did? With exactly what you said. We went to the customers and said, which product do you want to buy? And how are we going to do this? So in 4.5 months, we developed a low-cost diaper that basically took 25% of the market in 9 months. And it was a very profitable. So, and it was an idea from a production guy because we socialized the research.
Right. So let's not be afraid to involve our teams. And it's not all doom and gloom. As Jaime talked about, there's a lot of opportunity, and your team are in the trenches. They know the information, they have the data, use them. Kevin.
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up on your comment, Don, about working with suppliers. And, from a macro view, think about it. 3-5 years ago, just-in-time inventories was the key. JIT, everybody was talking about efficiency. Well, the last couple of years with supply chain issues and pandemic, it's turned to JGI, just get it. So, just can I get it in? JGI, let's do it. Well, guess what? In a recession, it's going to go back to JIT. So how do we help them do that? How do we look at our suppliers and say, hey, let's get to a just-in-time inventory. Let's give you better lead times. Let's do some things. How do we internally do JIT? Because we've all just gotten away from that because of other reasons, but that muscle is atrophied. So let's start thinking about that as well. Not just for our entire value supply chain, not just us, but our stakeholders as well.
Awesome. And I have a question here that's asking about taxes and tax planning. You think about this recession, the timing, if it starts hitting soon, we come up to the end of the year, we're 3-6 months into it. What happens if I have a lot of AR, accounts receivable? Are there techniques I should be thinking about with reserve? Or if I have inventory, then do I just throw it away, or what do I do there? Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to assess it very much, but you don't have to have the inventory in the dumpster to write it off. I mean, you can look at your analytics and look at your probability of being able to sell that inventory, and you can set up reserves for obsolescence. Same thing for bad debts. If you see a pattern developing, you can start to increase your reserve, and that's what good companies do. So I think that's something you can work with your financial team and accountants with, but that's where a place where you can really push the envelope, and you should push the envelope.
Yeah, and I like the double benefit, right? You increase your reserve, reduce your taxable income this year, but that could then become collectible in the future. And so you get the benefit of recovering that in the future tax years. Awesome. Shep.
Just want to build on Kevin, and I agree completely in doing it, but communicate clearly and transparently with your bank about what you're doing, because when they get those year-end statements, or if you have certain covenants and restrictions, be careful what those write-offs might cause. So just be aware and communicate transparently.
Great. Thank you. Jaime and then Ramona.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Kevin and Shap, the other thing is not all receivables are the same. Not all inventory is the same. So there is an art there, or how we cluster each one of the receivables and how we cluster each one of the AR, and what's the strategic role of each one of them. So for example, I put a process in place for AR, aging AR over 90 days, past dues over 90 days, which is totally different than for the ones that were below 60 days. And the risk that I was able to take in the 90 days is much greater. To your point, Kevin, the write-off was already there. So if I could recuperate, so my objectives for the plus 90 days were like recuperate 30% and spend per order much lower than everything else. So being able to cluster the inventory and cluster the AR in a way that the actions are different for each type of AR or type of inventory is also critical.
Awesome. Ramona.
Yeah, I was going to shift gears just a little bit because Jaime just covered what I was going to share. But I also think there's a real opportunity to broaden your view of what business you're in. That creates other opportunities to use assets that you have. For example, I work with a company who's in the produce business, produce distribution business. When a devastating weather effect hit the island where they do most of their business, they actually redefined the business they're in to be in the refrigerated products distribution business. It dramatically opened up what they could put on their trucks, what they were good at, what markets they could serve, and how they could move their goods. And that has stuck after that devastating effect was the country had healed from that. So there's real opportunity to just change the thinking of the business you're in, may help you move inventory faster, may help you utilize assets more efficiently just by changing your lens a little bit.
And what I love about that, Ramona, is as we said at the beginning, well, what if the recession doesn't happen? Well, worst case, we now have new strategies we could explore, even if the recession doesn't happen. So I love that thinking, pushing us to challenge our strategy. And I always say a good strategy not only tells us what we will do, but what we won't do. And that refrigeration example is a classic of what products and what space we just won't play in. All right, Randy, let me give you the last word.
Yeah, well, two things. I love Ramona's where she was going with that. Is of how do you actually pivot into a new market or a new opportunity? And I think we have to make sure that we are keeping close and going into our customers and finding out where their weak points are. And actually, what can we do to help solve some of the challenges that they face? Because there might lie an opportunity for us to take more business and provide more service. The second is looking at your pivot options. Right, this market is going to change, and so how are we going to change? We're not just in the survival mode, but we want to thrive through this and actually find the opportunities. And we don't want to get too far away from our core, but taking a step away from our core, whether it's a new product to same customers or a new product to, a new customer with the same products. Like take a step away from your core into a market that's there, but don't get too far afield, but find the opportunities in the midst of the opportunities because they are there. This isn't all doom and gloom. This is a shift in market. And what are you going to do to shift with the market and actually yield the opportunities that are in front of you?
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, panelists. Thank you for all your insights. I certainly have a ton of takeaways. And here's my final thoughts. Recessions are typically short-lived and followed by long periods of growth and prosperity. More importantly, they separate the winners from the losers. So study what companies in your industry emerged as the winners in past recessions and identify what they did differently. Also consider, where have you failed in scenario planning in the past? What did you do wrong? What warning signs did you miss? If you could do it all over again, what would you do differently? Lastly, focus on the one thing that you should do today to start mitigating your risks. So if you're interested in learning more, especially how to use any of the tools we showcased in this webcast, please sign up for a free scenario planning call with one of our expert coaches by clicking the link in the chat box now. Thank you all.